In this Nightreign video, I'm going to be talking about some observations of some things that I learned while playing the Nightreign Network Test. Some of you might have figured out, other ones you probably haven't. Just going through my footage over the last couple days and kind of seeing what's what with the game. I am going to do a separate video talking about the classes or each of the Night Fares and what I like about them, what I don't like about them. Talking about if they need any changes to them and their mechanics. But in this video, I would just want to talk about some observations that I've made about things that I saw in the network test that may or may not need to be changed in the full version of the game. So the first thing that we learned is that weapons actually do have scaling. This is something that was not obviously apparent to us when we were playing pre-network test in Germany, and that using different weapons with different characters will actually have different attack power based off the native stats of that hero. So each hero seems to have some hidden strength, dexterity, intelligence, faith values that are not available to be seen in the game. And so when they use a weapon that has high dexterity scaling, if they have high dexterity, they're going to do more damage than a character that has low dexterity, etc. So even though every character can technically use any weapon in Elden Ring Nightreign, they're going to be more or less effective with those weapons depending on what character or what Night Fare you choose. That doesn't mean that you can't use certain weapons if you're playing certain characters. It just means you're going to be a little bit less effective. But of course, you know, if you pick up Rivers of Blood or something and you're playing Recluse, you still might want to use it anyway because it's a damn good weapon. And just know that it might be slightly less effective than some other characters. The next thing we learned is that certain bosses drop certain types of weapons, and you can actually look at your map and see what sort of weapons they will drop. And this is actually a great predictor as well of trying to determine what boss you're going to face in an area. So during the network test, there were actually two versions of the map where you would drop in, you know, an spawn point A or B, which I mentioned in my previous video. But spawn point A has different, you know, elements and status effects areas on the map than map B does. They just have different elements or different status effects in those locations, and that's also going to indicate what boss may be present there. For instance, if you see a fire icon at an encampment on the map, you can almost certainly predict currently that flame chariots are going to be the bosses there, and when you defeat them, you will be given at least one fire-infused weapon. Whereas if you see a fire symbol in like a church or a different building like a castle, it might be a different boss like a fire prelate that will also give you a fire weapon upon defeating it. The ancient heroes of Zamor, for instance, will give you a frost weapon if you defeat them, or if you defeat a sanguine noble in a location, it will give you a blood-infused weapon. So you can actually kind of determine what sort of weapons you want based on like how you set your passive relics up on your character and head for those locations to optimally get a weapon for your build. Now, in the full version of the game, there should be more variations of these that you'll have to kind of learn. But this just kind of gives you some insight in that every time you get A, everything is the same as it is every other A run, and every time you get B, everything is the same as every other B run. So if there's C, D, E, and F, etc., they should be the same every time you get those layouts. The next thing I learned during the network test is that status effects are still king in this game, just like they were in Elden Ring, especially Bleed and Frostbite. They are absolutely deadly. They seem to be more easily triggered on enemies, not only like initially, but also on subsequent triggers. I don't know if Nightreign has like changed the resistances. You know, in Elden Ring, typically after you set bleed once, it was like twice as hard to set it again, and then twice as hard to set it again after that, and it would be, you know, increasingly more difficult, and it is in this game as well, but not to that extent in my experience. So right now, status effects are the best things you can have on weapons, and heading for bleed, frostbite, Scarlet Rot, and Poison all seem to be the best ways to go. Another observation I made during the network test is that dragons seem to drop the best loot. I kind of theorized about this when I was in Germany, since we defeated one dragon and got 2 orange items from it. But dragons tend to drop purple items, like 2 purple items or a purple and an orange item, each time you defeat them. So if you see dragons on the map, you always want to try and take them down. They're usually not that difficult. I imagine on, you know, different maps and things like that, there might be harder and harder dragons. But on the one that you're playing during the network test, it was, you know, pretty standard dragon, pretty easy if you've played Elden Ring at all. So you should definitely be on the lookout for dragons and the good loot that they have. And it seems like purple and orange items are the unique items in the game. It's not 100% true. For instance, like claws don't have a unique claws, and they've made one of them purple anyway. But typically, if you see a purple item or an orange item, it's typically some special weapon with its own, weapon skill that's unique to it. So that seems to be why they've made them purple and orange. And the next thing I noticed is that passive buffs that you find on weapons, while randomized, also have a quality to them based on the quality of the weapon. So, like, if you get, I don't know, let's say, increased stance damage while two-handing plus 10% on common, if you find it on rare, you might get 15%, and if you find it on epic, you might get 20% or 25%, and if you get it on orange, you'll be even higher. So you can find better versions of passive buffs on higher quality weapons, and you should be on the lookout for these too, because it seems like currently that even if you find like a lower version and you upgrade it with smithing stones from common to rare or something like that, it doesn't seem to increase the passive benefit that it already has. So finding better versions of weapons for better passive effects that you might already have on something else is more viable than trying to upgrade. The next thing I observed is that Evergaols seem like they should largely be avoided for the most part for a couple reasons. First of all, they don't drop any loot when you defeat the boss. There is a Site of Grace that spawns and you can level up, which is nice. But most people are gunning for bosses that not only give them experience, but also give them some sort of reward. And Evergaols don't currently do that. Additionally, you need a Stone's Word key in order to open an Evergaol, and you may not have one in your group. So if you're running for one and you don't have one, you can't even open it. And your Stone's Word key takes up a very valuable consumable slot that you might rather have something else in it. So currently, Evergaols don't really seem worth it for the most part. I'm sure there are exceptions, and it's not like you'll never do an Evergaol. Like, you might be right there and have a key, and it makes sense to do it. But for the most part, you're probably going to try and find other things that give you rewards. Next, caves seem largely useless in the network test. It looks like they have pathing that allows you to get from certain locations to other locations, and you can find some smithing stones in there occasionally, but for the most part, there doesn't seem to be like any boss in there. There doesn't seem to be a lot of reason to go in there other than traversing the map, and traversing over the top of things is not overly difficult in my experience. And caves can be a really bad location to be, like if you get invaded by Fell Omen. Trying to fight in a tight quarters is not good. And, if the Nightreign suddenly comes in while you're in caves, there's only limited directions you can run. So I don't know if caves need a rework, or maybe they'll have higher quality smithing stones in the full version of the game, so it will give you a reason to go into them. But right now, they're kind of dangerous places to go for not a lot of reward. And the next thing I have observed, which you might laugh at because you might say, well, duh, but RNG plays a significant role in the success or failure of any run in Elden Ring Nightreign. And skilled players can overcome a certain amount of RNG. There's no doubt about that, you could still get dealt a bad hand and still come out on top. That's definitely happened before. But there are some scenarios where you get super bad RNG that even the best players aren't going to be able to win every single time. And conversely, average players or less than average players that are typically having a hard time clearing the content can get really good RNG that makes it so they don't have to play as well to overcome the content, which I find very, very interesting. I mean, this is typical of roguelike games, and I think it's one of the things that makes them so interesting is that you never know what kind of run you're going to have. You might have a godlike run, or you might have a really bad run. And if the best players never had any fear of not winning, then it wouldn't be interesting. And conversely, if the worst players had no hope of beating it, it wouldn't be very interesting. So I kind of like this element. But damn, you can get some bad runs. Like my last run on the very last network test, I was playing Duchess, and every single item I picked up was for casters. Like every single one. I got to the final boss, and all I had was like 5 items and my starting dagger, and the 5 items, like 2 had buffs that actually helped me in some way. And we just got absolutely annihilated. So it can absolutely happen that you get bad RNG and you can't overcome it. But I think it's one of the things that makes each run interesting. And another thing that I'll mention I've noticed is that pinning things on the map is really well implemented in Nightreign. It doesn't take up your whole screen. It doesn't take long to do. People can see it very easily. The color coding per character makes it obvious who's going where. If you double stack pins, turning white gives you a consensus of where people agree to go. And I would say that the single most predictor of whether a run was going to be successful or not was pinning things on the map. Did people follow the pins? Did people use their pins? Were people going in all different directions? Did they put pins in 3 different places? It was the single biggest predictor on whether a run was going to succeed or fail, was whether people were using pins and whether they were following pins. It wasn't the only predictor. Like sometimes people didn't use their pins at all and they'd follow my pin, or I didn't pin anything but they pinned stuff and I would follow their pins, and they still worked out sometimes. But generally speaking, when people weren't using them or were just ignoring them, it was chaos and the runs went really, really badly. And sort of piggybacking off that, one of the things I noticed as well is that party makeup is not a good predictor of success or failure in a run in Nightreign. I think this is absolutely great, because you don't want to go into your hero selection screen and know instantly that you're probably going to fail your run based on what heroes people pick. People don't want to be forced into picking a meta of heroes in order to succeed in this game. They want to be able to play whoever they want and still have a good chance to succeed, and I think so far that is the case. We had a pull up on our YouTube channel a couple days ago, which one is your favorite? It seems pretty even, with Wilder being a bit ahead of the rest, which I kind of predicted. He's just such a good character for new players. I think this will balance out more over time as the game launches and people get more familiar with the game mechanics. I don't think Wilder will be as popular then, particularly when there are new heroes. But it's so great that you can go in with 2 Guardians and a Recluse and still win, or 2 Duchesses and a Wilder and still win, or whatever. You don't have to have a set makeup, and you can absolutely still win. And the last observation that I made was that the game desperately needs more map variety than what we have. If this is the only map that we play on, we're in trouble already. And I'm not talking about different spawn locations, changing where the rises and churches are. I'm talking about the maps itself, because as it stands now, there are already meta runs for the first 2 spawn locations, and if there are 3 or 4 or 5 more in the full game for this map, they'll be figured out on day 1 or day 2, and that's what everyone will do on every run, and there'll be very little variety after that to what you're doing. Everyone knows to go here, then here, then here. That's just makes the most sense. And if there aren't other maps to explore and dive into, I think Nightreign is going to be in a very bad place. Now, I don't know if there are or not. It seems like there's been discussion around there will be other maps or not other maps. It's kind of confusing to me, honestly, from what I've heard. I've heard there are going to be other maps. I've heard there are not going to be other maps, but I don't really know. I would say this game probably needs at least 2 or 3 other maps in order to, mix things up a bit. And I'm not just talking about the landscape. I'm talking about the way each map looks, the vibe of each map, etc. If it had more of those, this game would definitely have a lot more staying power than if it just remains on this one map. So that just wraps up some of my observations for Elden Ring Nightreign's network tests. I know some of this may change in the full version of the game. These are not all set in stone, and we are seeing just a sliver probably of what this game actually is, not unlike when we saw Limgrave before Elden Ring launched. Those are some of my observations. Did you guys notice some of these things? Or is some of this new information to you? What do you make of the network test? Let me know in the comments below.